Today we are presenting a research paper by Ashraf Dowla titled Habit Philosophy and Civilizational Coherence. With academic training in military studies and peace and conflict studies, and nearly 3 decades of field experience, Dowla integrates strategy, psychology, and social dynamics into a practical peace-building framework. He argues that modern conflict begins in cognition, not on physical battlefields. Beliefs, identity, media exposure, and repeated narratives gradually shape mental habits that influence social behavior and national stability. In this paper, he advances a powerful thesis. Philosophy itself emerges from structured mental habits formed through repetition, social reinforcement, and institutional continuity. Moral systems, political ideologies, and epistemic frameworks are not detached abstractions, but articulated expressions of stabilized cognitive architectures. He proposes that civilizational coherence depends on self-respect, understood as reflective governance of our own mental habits. Sustainable peace, therefore, requires psychological stabilization and restored dignity at both individual and collective levels. Let us begin. Introduction. Philosophy has traditionally been presented as the highest expression of rational reflection. From Plato's metaphysical inquiry to Kant's moral law, philosophical systems are frequently portrayed as products of disciplined reasoning, capable of rising above habit, emotion, and social contingency. In this classical image, philosophy appears autonomous and self-grounding, governed by logical necessity rather than formative conditioning. Yet this image leaves unresolved a deeper question. What if philosophical thought does not precede psychological formation, but emerges within it? What if the categories through which philosophers reason are themselves shaped by durable patterns of perception, valuation, and interpretation acquired through repetition? What if philosophy is not detached from habit, but articulated through it? This article advances the thesis that mental habits constitute the foundational language of philosophical thought. Philosophical systems do not arise in a vacuum of pure rationality. They crystallize from structured cognitive and affective dispositions formed through neurobiological plasticity, reinforced through social interaction, stabilized within institutions, and transmitted across generations. These dispositions shape what appears plausible, meaningful, morally compelling, or epistemically authoritative. The formative power of habit has long been recognized in partial form. Aristotle described virtue as acquired through habituation rather than innate possession. William James emphasized habit as the stabilizing mechanism of psychological life. Bourdieu articulated habitus as socially sedimented disposition. Foucault demonstrated how discursive formations structure fields of intelligibility. Contemporary cognitive science further reveals that automatic processing precedes reflective reasoning in much of human judgment. Despite these insights, philosophical inquiry has rarely extended the concept of habit to the architecture of philosophical systems themselves across moral, political, epistemological, and metaphysical domains. The present study seeks to fill this conceptual gap by developing a unified anthropological account of philosophical formation. Research question. The central research question guiding this inquiry is: in what sense can mental habits be understood as the foundational language through which philosophical thought becomes intelligible across moral, political, epistemological, and metaphysical domains? A secondary question follows. If philosophical systems emerge within multi-level habit architectures, what regulative principle enables coherent adaptation rather than fragmentation at the level of civilization? Hypothesis. This article advances the following hypothesis. Philosophical systems are structured articulations of stabilized cognitive architectures formed through recursive interaction between neurobiological plasticity, psychological consolidation, social reinforcement, and institutional sedimentation. The long-term coherence of such architectures depends upon a regulative capacity termed self-respect, understood as reflective governance of habituated disposition at both individual and collective levels. The hypothesis is structural rather than deterministic. It does not claim that philosophy is reducible to biology or sociology. Rather, it proposes that rational deliberation unfolds within embodied and socially embedded horizons shaped by patterned repetition. Methodological orientation. This study adopts a conceptual and interdisciplinary philosophical methodology. It does not present empirical findings derived from experimental measurement. Rather, it advances a structural explanatory thesis through integrative theoretical analysis. The approach may be described as philosophical anthropology, informed by contemporary cognitive science and social theory. Classical sources, including Aristotle and Kant, are examined alongside modern theorists such as Bourdieu, Foucault, McIntyre, and Taylor. These are placed in dialogue with research on neuroplasticity, automatic cognition, and reflective regulation. The aim is not to reduce philosophy to psychology or neuroscience, but to illuminate the pre-reflective architectures within which philosophical reasoning becomes intelligible. The method proceeds through conceptual reconstruction. Major philosophical domains, including ethics, existential thought, political theory, epistemology, and metaphysics, are reinterpreted as articulations of stabilized cognitive orientation. This reconstruction identifies structural continuities across traditions without collapsing their normative distinctiveness. The thesis is reflexively aware. It acknowledges that the present argument itself emerges within conditioned intellectual horizons. Its validity rests not on transcendence from formation, but on explanatory coherence, argumentative rigor, and openness to critical revision. Scope and structure. The argument unfolds in several stages. First, the conceptual framework clarifies the distinction between habit, habitus, cognitive architecture, and foundational language. Second, a multi-level anthropological model situates habit formation within neurobiological, psychological, social, and institutional layers. Third, major domains of philosophy are examined as structured articulations of stabilized orientation. Fourth, objections concerning reductionism, relativism, and autonomy are addressed. Finally, the concept of self-respect is developed as a civilizational regulative principle capable of sustaining normative coherence while enabling adaptive renewal. Through this progression, philosophy is reframed not as detached abstraction, but as disciplined participation in the formation and regulation of collective cognitive architecture. Conceptual clarification. Habit, habitus, and foundational language. If mental habits are to be regarded as foundational to philosophical thought, the central concepts of the thesis must be clearly distinguished. Without conceptual precision, the argument risks collapsing into metaphor or reductionism. Habit refers here to a durable cognitive or affective disposition formed through repetition. It is not merely behavioral routine. Rather, it is a patterned orientation that shapes perception, evaluation, and response prior to explicit reasoning. Aristotle's notion of hexis captures this dispositional stability acquired through repeated action. Contemporary cognitive science confirms that repeated activation consolidates neural pathways, strengthening patterns of interpretation and reaction. Habit, therefore, denotes stabilized orientation rather than isolated behavior. Habitus extends this concept into the social domain, as developed by Bourdieu. Habitus refers to socially sedimented dispositions internalized through upbringing, institutional participation, and historical continuity. Whereas habit may describe individual cognitive stabilization, Habitus emphasizes the transmission of patterned orientation across generations. It bridges psychological formation and social structure. Through habitus, history becomes embodied. Cognitive architecture designates the organized configuration of layered habits and habitus that together structure a person's field of intelligibility. It includes attentional biases, evaluative tendencies, emotional orientations, and interpretive patterns that interact in relatively stable form. Cognitive architecture is neurally instantiated, but not reducible to neural description. It is socially conditioned, but not exhausted by social explanation. It represents the stabilized interplay of biological plasticity and social formation. Foundational language does not imply linguistic primacy. It refers to tacit grammar. Just as grammatical rules structure speech without appearing explicitly in every sentence, habituated cognitive architectures structure philosophical reasoning without functioning as explicit premises. They delimit plausibility, salience, and resonance. Philosophical doctrines articulate explicit claims, but these claims operate within prior grammars of evaluation and interpretation. The thesis may now be stated precisely. Philosophical reasoning unfolds within cognitive architectures formed through the recursive interaction of individual habit and socially sedimented habitus. These architectures structure the horizon within which arguments become intelligible, persuasive, or compelling. This claim is structural rather than deterministic. Habit conditions the field of reasoning without mechanically dictating its content. Rational deliberation remains operative, but it is situated within formed orientation. With these distinctions established, the analysis must now situate habit within a broader anthropological framework that integrates biological, psychological, social, and institutional levels. Multi-level architecture of habit formation. Habit does not originate solely in psychology, nor solely in society. It arises within a multi-level architecture that spans neurobiology, individual cognition, social interaction, and institutional structure. Understanding this layered formation is essential to avoiding both biological reductionism and sociological determinism. At the biological level, habit is neurally instantiated. Repetition strengthens synaptic pathways and stabilizes patterns of activation. Neuroplasticity provides the capacity for consolidation. Human beings inherit temperamental predispositions and affective sensitivities shaped by evolutionary history. These predispositions are not fully formed habits, but they scaffold habit formation by biasing attention and response. At the psychological level, repeated neural activation consolidates into stable cognitive and affective dispositions. These dispositions guide attention, shape valuation, and influence interpretation prior to deliberate reflection. Kahneman's distinction between automatic and reflective processing illustrates how much judgment relies upon learned pattern recognition, operating beneath conscious reasoning. Psychological habit, therefore, represents stabilized interpretive orientation. At the social level, individual dispositions become mutually reinforced through interaction. Repeated behavioral patterns generate expectation structures. When these patterns become collectively anticipated and normatively sanctioned, they solidify into customs and norms. Norms are not merely aggregated habits. They are socially codified expectations maintained through approval, disapproval, and institutional reinforcement. Through this process, socially shared cognitive orientations stabilize across generations. At the institutional level, stabilized norms are formalized within legal systems, educational curricula, ritual practices, and symbolic orders. Institutions function as transmission mechanisms that preserve and reproduce patterned orientations beyond individual lifespans. They reinforce certain habits while marginalizing others. At the civilizational level, these institutionalized patterns generate large-scale architectures of meaning. Dominant moral intuitions, epistemic preferences, political ideals, and metaphysical assumptions become embedded within collective identity. What begins as neural stabilization becomes civilizational worldview. Crucially, this formation is recursive rather than linear. Social norms shape psychological habit. Psychological stabilization reshapes neural pathways. Institutions reinforce social expectations. Civilizational narratives condition future formation. Human beings are not passive recipients of structure. Unlike most non-human organisms, which operate primarily through genetically stabilized behavioral repertoires, human beings possess the capacity to reflect upon and reorganize learned habits. This reflective capacity enables modification of both personal disposition and social structure. Philosophy emerges within this layered architecture. Philosophical systems articulate and refine the stabilized orientations produced by multi-level habit formation. They do not float above it, nor are they reducible to it. They are reflective expressions of it. Moral philosophy as structured evaluative architecture. Moral philosophy is often portrayed as the domain in which universal principles are derived through rational analysis. Yet moral reasoning does not arise in a conceptual vacuum. It unfolds within stabilized evaluative architectures shaped by multi-level habit formation. At the psychological level, moral intuitions emerge from repeated patterns of approval, disapproval, reward, and sanction. Early developmental experience shapes effective responses to fairness, loyalty, authority, harm, and reciprocity. These patterns consolidate into durable evaluative tendencies. Contemporary moral psychology suggests that many moral judgments operate initially through intuitive processing rather than explicit reasoning, with reasoning frequently functioning as post hoc justification. At the social level, these individual dispositions are reinforced and standardized within shared normative frameworks. Communities codify expectations regarding duty, virtue, justice, and care. Through repetition and sanction, these norms become internalized as seemingly self-evident moral truths. Bourdieu's concept of habitus illuminates how moral orientation becomes embodied through participation in structured social practice. At the institutional level, moral norms are formalized within educational systems, religious traditions, and legal codes. Institutions stabilize evaluative orientation across generations, reinforcing particular moral grammars while marginalizing alternatives. Within this architecture, moral philosophy articulates and systematizes stabilized evaluative orientations. Aristotle's virtue ethics, grounded in habituated character formation, directly recognizes this dynamic. Virtue is acquired through repeated action until disposition becomes stable. Ethical excellence reflects embodied formation rather than abstract deduction. Kant's deontological framework appears at first to detach morality from inclination by grounding it in universalizable maxims. Yet the compelling force of duty presupposes a mind habituated to value principled consistency. Societies that repeatedly reinforce rule, governed conduct, cultivate dispositions in which universalizability resonates as morally authoritative. Utilitarianism, articulated by Mill as the maximization of happiness, presupposes evaluative habits oriented toward aggregation and distributive calculation. What counts as happiness and how it is weighed depends upon stabilized cultural valuations and effective conditioning. Care ethics emphasizes relational responsiveness as foundational to moral reasoning. Such responsiveness arises from repeated participation in networks of dependency and nurturance. The moral salience of care reflects stabilized attention, orientation toward vulnerability, and interdependence. These traditions differ doctrinally, yet each may be interpreted as a systematic articulation of embedded evaluative architecture. Duty reflects habituated respect for normativity. Virtue reflects habituated character formation. Utility reflects habituated valuation of welfare. Care reflects habituated relational attentiveness. This interpretation does not render moral claims arbitrary. Rather, it situates moral reasoning within structured cognitive horizons. Rational argument refines and critiques inherited patterns, but it does so through architectures already shaped by repetition and reinforcement. Moral philosophy therefore exemplifies the central thesis. Explicit doctrine emerges within stabilized evaluative grammar, formed through multi-level habit formation. Existential and humanistic philosophy as architectures of meaning. Existential and humanistic philosophies center on freedom, authenticity, dignity, and self-realization. These traditions often emphasize radical responsibility and the creation of meaning. Yet even the experience of freedom and the aspiration toward authenticity unfold within stabilized, cognitive, and affective architectures formed through multi-level habit formation. At the psychological level, the interpretation of uncertainty depends upon habituated emotional orientation. Some individuals encounter openness as possibility, others as anxiety. Heidegger described anxiety as a mood revealing the contingency of existence. However, mood itself is not unconditioned. Repeated experiences of security or instability shape how ambiguity is perceived. Habituated affective responses structure the existential field within which freedom is experienced. At the social level, identity is formed dialogically. Charles Taylor argues that the modern self develops within moral frameworks that define what counts as fulfillment and integrity. These frameworks are transmitted through narrative, ritual, and institutional reinforcement. The aspiration to authenticity therefore presupposes inherited interpretive horizons that define what authenticity means. Humanistic psychology reinforces this structural account. Rogers's conception of the fully functioning person presupposes conditions of unconditional regard that enable openness to experience. Maslow's model of self-actualization situates growth within hierarchical fulfillment of needs. These accounts recognize that the capacity for self-realization depends upon prior psychological stabilization shaped by repeated experience. At the institutional level, educational and cultural systems influence whether exploration, conformity, independence, or obedience are rewarded. These reinforcements consolidate into stabilized orientations toward authority, creativity, and responsibility. Existential freedom, therefore, does not emerge in a psychological vacuum. It unfolds within architectures that shape how choice is perceived and evaluated. Sartre's claim that individuals are condemned to be free presupposes a subject capable of reflective self-awareness. That capacity itself develops through repeated practice of introspection and disciplined attention. The structural thesis does not deny existential responsibility. Rather, it situates responsibility within formed architecture. Individuals choose, but the intelligibility of their choices is mediated by stabilized patterns of perception and valuation. Authenticity requires reflective regulation of inherited dispositions rather than spontaneous detachment from them. Existential and humanistic philosophies thus articulate stabilized orientations toward uncertainty, identity, and aspiration. They exemplify how even doctrines centered on freedom operate within structured cognitive architecture, political philosophy as institutionalized collective habitus. Political philosophy concerns justice, authority, obligation, rights, and the organization of collective life. It is frequently framed as a contest of normative principles derived through rational deliberation. Yet political systems endure not solely because arguments are logically coherent, but because they resonate with stabilized collective orientations embedded across multi-level habit architecture. At the psychological level, individuals develop durable orientations toward authority, equality, hierarchy, cooperation, and competition through repeated experience within family, education, and economic life. These dispositions influence how political claims are perceived and evaluated. At the social level, repeated interaction consolidates these dispositions into shared expectations. Norms concerning legitimacy, fairness, loyalty, and entitlement become collectively stabilized. Bourdieu's concept of habitus captures how such shared orientations become embodied and reproduced through participation in structured social fields. At the institutional level, these stabilized norms are formalized within constitutions, legal systems, educational curricula, and civic rituals. Institutions do not merely enforce rules. They reinforce cognitive and affective patterns that shape political imagination. Within this architecture, political philosophies articulate and justify stabilized collective orientations. Liberalism, grounded in the primacy of individual rights and consent, presupposes habituated valuation of autonomy and personal responsibility. Locke's defense of natural rights resonates within societies where individual agency has been repeatedly reinforced in economic and educational practice. Socialist traditions, drawing upon Marx's analysis of material conditions, articulate orientations formed within shared labor, economic interdependence, and collective vulnerability. Repeated experience of cooperation stabilizes evaluative emphasis on solidarity and distributive equity. Traditionalist political thought, exemplified by Burke, values continuity and inherited structure. In societies where ritual, lineage, and stable hierarchy are repeatedly affirmed, continuity becomes morally resonant. Nationalism, described by Anderson as sustained through shared narrative and symbolic imagination, emerges from repeated exposure to collective memory and identity formation. Through educational and ceremonial reinforcement, belonging becomes embodied orientation. Foucault's analysis of discursive regimes further illuminates how political categories are normalized within particular historical formations. Institutional repetition shapes the boundaries of intelligibility within political discourse. Political conflict, therefore, often reflects divergence in stabilized cognitive architecture rather than mere disagreement over explicit propositions. Participants in ideological disputes may operate within partially distinct habit grammars that structure salience differently. Recognizing this multi-level formation clarifies why rational debate alone may fail to resolve polarization. Where collective habit architectures diverge significantly, argumentative exchange encounters structural limits of mutual intelligibility. Political philosophy thus exemplifies how institutionalized habitus shapes the normative imagination of societies. Epistemology and metaphysics as structured orientations of knowing. Epistemology and metaphysics are often regarded as the most abstract domains of philosophy. They inquire into the nature of knowledge, truth, and reality itself. Because of their conceptual elevation, they are frequently assumed to operate independently of psychological and social conditioning. Yet even these foundational inquiries unfold within stabilized cognitive architectures shaped by multi-level habit formation. At the biological and psychological levels, attentional patterns and interpretive biases are consolidated through repetition. Neuroplasticity stabilizes certain modes of pattern recognition and inference. Kahneman's distinction between automatic and reflective processing suggests that much reasoning operates through learned cognitive shortcuts before conscious deliberation occurs. Stanovich further emphasizes that reflective override requires deliberate effort and metacognitive discipline. These findings indicate that epistemic orientation is shaped by habituated processing long before explicit theory is formulated. At the social level, educational systems and intellectual traditions reinforce particular epistemic standards. Methods of verification, standards of evidence, and norms of argumentation are transmitted across generations. These reinforce specific attention grammars regarding what counts as reliable knowledge. Within this architecture, epistemological traditions articulate stabilized orientations toward knowing. Rationalism privileges internal coherence, deductive clarity, and necessary connection. Descartes' search for indubitable foundations reflects a stabilized orientation toward logical order as epistemic authority. Such orientation is reinforced in intellectual cultures that repeatedly reward formal reasoning. Empiricism privileges observation, sensory verification, and experiential evidence. Hume's emphasis on impressions as the basis of knowledge resonates within contexts where practical engagement and experimental inquiry are repeatedly reinforced. The habit of outward attention stabilizes trust in empirical method. Skepticism, articulated in classical form by Sextus Empiricus, reflects habituated sensitivity to contradiction and epistemic uncertainty. Repeated exposure to competing claims may stabilize a durable orientation towards suspension of judgment. Metaphysical commitments similarly reflect stabilized interpretive grammar. Idealism privileges internal experience and conceptual structure. Materialism privileges tangible process and physical causation. Dualism reflects entrenched habits of binary classification, reinforced through cultural narratives of opposition. Foucault's analysis of epistemic regimes demonstrates that what counts as knowledge within a given epoch is shaped by historically sedimented discursive practices. These practices stabilize interpretive orientation at the collective level. Epistemology and metaphysics therefore articulate structured orientations of knowing rather than emerging from purely disembodied rationality. This claim does not deny the possibility of truth. Rather, it situates epistemic pursuit within conditioned horizons of intelligibility. Rational argument remains central, but it operates within architectures shaped by repetition, social reinforcement, and institutional transmission. The divergence between philosophical schools of thought thus often reflects differences in stabilized cognitive orientation. Recognizing this structural formation clarifies why epistemic disagreement can persist even under sustained argumentative exchange. With these domain applications complete, the analysis now turns to the neuronormative hinge of the framework: self-respect as civilizational regulative principle. Self-respect as civilizational regulative principle. If philosophical systems emerge within multi-level habit architectures, and if moral, political, epistemic, and metaphysical orientations reflect stabilized patterns of formation, then the long-term coherence of collective life depends upon a regulative capacity capable of sustaining alignment across these layers. This capacity is here termed self-respect. Self-respect in the present framework does not denote emotional self-esteem or pride, nor does it refer merely to personal confidence. It designates the disciplined capacity of individuals and communities to recognize, regulate, and responsibly shape the habits that structure their cognitive architecture. It is reflective governance of formation. At the biological and psychological levels, self-respect involves awareness of one's own conditioned dispositions. Neuroplasticity makes habit formation possible, but it also allows modification. The individual capable of reflective regulation can interrupt automatic processing, examine stabilized orientation, and deliberately reinforce or revise it. Stanovich's account of reflective override illustrates the cognitive capacity required for such regulation. Self-respect thus integrates automatic processing with reflective supervision. At the social level, self-respect manifests as accountability within shared normative systems. Individuals who recognize that their moral intuitions arise within formed architectures are less likely to absolutize impulse. This recognition fosters humility without paralysis. Normative disagreement remains possible, but it is moderated by awareness of conditioning. Such moderation reduces reactive polarization and strengthens deliberative stability. At the institutional level, self-respect becomes educational and civic discipline. Institutions that cultivate reflective awareness alongside tradition enable continuity without rigidity. McIntyre's analysis of moral tradition emphasizes the importance of practices that sustain coherence across generations. However, tradition without reflection risks stagnation. Reflection without continuity risks fragmentation. Self-respect mediates between these extremes by sustaining disciplined evaluation of inherited norms. At the civilizational level, self-respect operates as an organizing principle of adaptive coherence. Civilizations endure not merely through material power, but through the capacity to preserve stabilized orientation while revising it responsibly. Where reflective regulation weakens, collective habit architectures may fragment into mutually unintelligible orientations. Where rigid enforcement suppresses reflection, stagnation may result. Self-respect provides the normative hinge that allows continuity and adaptation to coexist. This conception reframes autonomy. Autonomy is not detachment from formation. It is the capacity to assume responsibility for formation. Nor is self-respect solely individual virtue. It has public consequence. Educational systems, political institutions, and cultural narratives either cultivate or erode reflective governance of habit. Within this framework, philosophy becomes more than theoretical discourse. It becomes disciplined participation in the shaping and regulation of collective cognitive architecture. Philosophical inquiry exposes the silent grammar of habit that underlies moral judgment, political allegiance, and epistemic conviction. Self-respect ensures that this exposure leads not to nihilism, but to responsible reconstruction. Through self-respect, the multi-level architecture described in this article acquires normative direction. It integrates biological plasticity, psychological consolidation, social codification, and institutional transmission into a coherent and adaptable civilizational order. Conclusion: habit, philosophy, and civilizational self-awareness. This article has advanced the thesis that mental habits constitute the foundational language of philosophical thought. Philosophy does not emerge from disembodied abstraction. It unfolds within multi-level architectures shaped by neurobiological plasticity, psychological consolidation, social reinforcement, and institutional sedimentation. Moral systems, political doctrines, epistemic frameworks, and metaphysical visions articulate stabilized orientations formed through recursive processes of repetition and transmission. By clarifying the distinction between habit, habitus, and cognitive architecture, the study has situated philosophical reasoning within embodied and socially embedded formation without collapsing into reductionism. Rational deliberation remains operative. Logical coherence and argumentative validity retain their force. Yet they function within structured horizons that shape what appears salient, plausible, or morally compelling. Recognizing this formation does not undermine philosophy. It renders visible the silent infrastructure that makes philosophy possible. The multi-level anthropological framework developed here demonstrates that individual habits become socially codified norms, that norms become institutionally reinforced patterns, and that these patterns sediment into civilizational architectures of meaning. Formation is recursive. Individuals shape institutions, even as institutions shape individuals. Neuroplasticity enables stabilization, but also revision. Continuity and transformation coexist within dynamic architecture. Within this structure, self-respect has been introduced as the regulative principle capable of sustaining alignment across levels. Self-respect integrates biological capacity, psychological discipline, social accountability, and institutional continuity. It reframes autonomy as reflective governance of formation rather than escape from it. Where reflective regulation is cultivated, collective habit architectures remain coherent yet adaptable. Where it erodes, fragmentation or rigidity may follow. The implications of this framework are civilizational rather than merely theoretical. Civilizations endure not solely through economic strength or political authority, but through coherent and adaptable cognitive architectures. Philosophy, when understood as reflective participation in the shaping of these architectures, becomes a form of civilizational self-awareness. It exposes inherited grammars of meaning and invites disciplined reconstruction. Mental habits are not peripheral to intellectual life. They are its underlying grammar. To reconstruct philosophy is therefore to reconstruct the architectures of habit through which meaning, identity, and judgment are formed. Such reconstruction does not abolish tradition. It renders tradition self-conscious. Nor does it dissolve rationality. It situates rationality within embodied formation. If philosophy is to remain relevant in an era of rapid technological, social, and political transformation, it must attend not only to propositions, but to the architectures that render propositions intelligible. In this attention lies the possibility of renewal. Philosophy becomes not merely analysis of arguments, but stewardship of the habits that shape collective reality. Through this recognition, philosophy returns to its most enduring task, enabling civilization to become aware of the conditions of its own thought.